Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak to everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. Joining me today is Katherine Lacefield to talk about fundraising for non-humans. Katherine, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I like to start off the episode by asking my favorite question, which is, what is your superhero origin story? That is to say, how did you get started working with nonprofits?
That's a long story to tell, but basically, I started working in nonprofits at a very young age, as of high school. So I was 13, I think, when we started high school, and I started volunteering in a variety of different nonprofits. I worked in old folks' homes. I worked for a Christmas parade at some point, and we just always had to do these volunteer hours in my high school. So that really got me more sensitive to what the reality was in my community and how to give back. And it just kind of became a passion of mine. I wanted to do it. It wasn't just an obligation anymore. So that's kind of how it started. And it just evolved as I got more involved in different causes, especially environmental causes that led to being aware of many different issues that were really affecting me. And that got me even more involved. And so I don't know if you want a funny story, but I decided to become vegetarian at the age of 15 because I had watched some animal cruelty videos online after, at first it was more the environment that was more my like passion, my go-to cause. But then of course, when you start getting involved in the environmental sphere, you start realizing the impact on animals as well. And I just remember the day when I sat my mother down. We were six kids, like we were a split up family so we were six kids, quite a lot in one house. And I sat my mom down and I was like, Mom, I want to be a vegetarian. And first she was like, wow, that's great. Like, such great news. You're going to go to school for that? And I kind of just looked in confusion of what? Like, no, like, why would I go to school for that? It's like, well, veterinarian, don't you need to go to a school? And I was like, no, veterinarian, Mom. No, I want to be a vegetarian. Like, I don't want to eat meat anymore. She's like, oh, no, not that, anything but that. So that's kind of, ever since I was young, I've always been in my family the one that was getting involved with different causes and making everyone really annoyed by constantly talking about it. So that's my little superhero story.
What I'd like to mention as well is that you mentioned high school. So you and I are maybe not at the moment, but we grew up maybe 10, 20 kilometers from each other. Like we're very local to each other, which is really cool. You're the first guest to be from the Montreal area in Canada. That's
Yep.
cool. Yeah, that's awesome. Very natural shift, you're right, from environmental to vegetarianism. Any reason why you haven't gone all the way to veganism out of curiosity? Because I dabbled with that myself for quite a while. And I try my best these days to be mostly vegetarian, but I do find personally, at least veganism is to be difficult. Did you find the same challenges? Is that why, or you just like
So
cheese?
no, I think, well, first of all, cheese is amazing. I mean, let's be honest here, but I hate saying it, but it's a fact. When I was 15, like, of course I started with vegetarians because back then, it's not that long ago, but it's a good, like, over 15 years ago, vegetarian and vegan products were not as relevant as they are now. So basically the grocery stores in my area in Saint-Jérôme didn't have that many products. And I was basically eating tofu most of the time and having to cook it myself. So being vegan was kind of a bit too much for me at the time at 15, but I actually dabbled in veganism pretty soon after. As soon as I moved out on my own at the age of 18, I started eating more vegan products, and I was in Montreal then. So there was a lot more available options. And I was kind of going on and off. I was traveling a lot, which made veganism a bit complicated. But then I started working for this animal rights organization, and that really just pushed me to go vegan. So I was actually very strict vegan for a couple of years, like 3 to 4 years. And then after meeting my partner, that kind of got put to an end for many different reasons. And that's a conversation for another day that I wouldn't mind having. But I was definitely on the vegan pathway because if you're working in animal rights, you kind of don't feel like you have a choice because you cannot say that you're against animal cruelty and then and still encourage the animal product industry, be it for milk and cheese, is just as cruel, if not in some cases worse so than the meat industry. So yeah, I've definitely dabbled. I actually have a tattoo that says tofu never screams. And it's these little tofu animals. So yeah, I was one of those crazy animal activists for quite some time.
I think if more people understood, factory farming and the impacts to not only the environment, but to the animals more people would become at least vegetarian, if not vegan. And that's the reason why I did it as well, too.
And I agree. I think there's a lot of education that is necessary, but maybe that can also just help explain why I am not as much into that system anymore, is because in the animal rights world, there's a lot of hate and a lot of stress and competition, even amongst themselves, around who's the most vegan and what are you doing and what, and it causes a lot of anxiety and a lot of burnout and a lot of compassion fatigue for a lot of the people working in it. And I remember when I was working even in an animal shelter before that, where every day was just this constant struggle of, oh, I hate humans, people are horrible, and just this feeling of just hating the world was, it's really not pushing people to, I believe, feel good. And I think people want to feel good in their lives. And so when you have this theory, or I guess this view of the world, this perspective that is very much focused on this pain and suffering all the time, it becomes very exhausting for a lot of people. So I think that's one of also the reasons why people are either avoiding it or leaving the movement, is because it's there's some negative sides to it as well.
I imagine there's some consequence to having to share that perspective with other people, because if you're coming from a more negative, darker space, a more hateful space, it's hard to educate people, or harder at least to educate people and bring them to your side, because it's ultimately better for the environment, better for the animals for sure. Mm-hmm. But if you're convincing people to join with you, or at least come with you to a certain extent, has to be from a place of love and understanding and acceptance from where they are now, and help them transition to and educate them for why they should, versus if they come from a negative perspective, like, why aren't you already a vegan, a vegetarian? That's a much more aggressive approach, and people can be very defensive at that point and
exactly
push the message away.
You're so right. And that's one of the reasons why I ended up taking a big break from animal rights and going towards more general philanthropy and nonprofit work, is that it was just exhausting. And I felt like I was becoming someone that I wasn't anymore. So that's also something that I think distinguishes a lot of, we talked about non-human philanthropy. It's a big factor, in my opinion, of what differentiates human-centered philanthropy versus non-human philanthropy, in the sense that I see this big gap between people that are defending non-human philanthropy, which I call anything that is under environment or an animal focused philanthropy. It obviously still has a huge impact on humans. So it's not actually non-human. It's just the direct activities are focused towards more non-human entities. And as I was mentioning before, when I was working in an animal shelter, for example, every day, one of the sentences I would hear the most was, oh, I hate people. I hate humans. Humans are so horrible. And because I get it, I would be faced with animals, and like, I don't even want to describe the situations they were in the states. And I was like, how could someone let this animal get to this state? Like, how could they do it? And it came from a place, now that I look back on it, it came from a place of a lack of compassion for the person as well, of understanding, and a lack of taking the time to try to understand the other. And I think that's something that creates this gap between the people that, quote unquote, care about animals. They end up pushing away a lot of people that are maybe in situations that they also need help. They're not necessarily doing it because they're all psychopaths. They're doing certain situations because they don't have the money, or they don't have the funds, or they don't have the education, and they didn't have the privilege that a lot of us did to understand how to take care of a pet, or how to take, how to avoid neglect. And it's not often coming from actual cruelty and desire to cause pain. And so that's where, by working in this space for so long, at first it was very frustrating. It made me very angry. And that ended up pushing away a lot of people. A lot of my friends and family were like, oh, you're too intense and you're scaring people away. And that wasn't the point. The point was to get people to learn. And like, my brother and my sister are the ones that are also now vegetarian for the most part. And I know that I've had a positive influence on a lot of people. And I believe it's when I became more excited about it and I was passionate about it. And people were like, wow, this person is so excited about this. Like, I want to be in on that too. So I would bring like vegan dishes to Christmas and be like, can you believe that's vegan? They're like, no, this is amazing. And so I really shifted my thinking from being one of judgment, of judging other people for, oh, how dare you? Like you said before, like, how dare you not be vegetarian? Like, how could you? I'm just trying to understand, like, hey, like, have you ever thought about it? And let's have a discussion and just be more open about it. And that's really caused a lot more positive impact than the opposite, which was much more based on judgment and hate, like you said.
Let's then shift to, I mentioned fundraising, but it's general philanthropy for nonprofits that work with non-humans. And I'm, in the pre-conversation, we talked a bit about animal shelters like the SPCA here in Montreal. So I was curious to know, high level, let's work our way from high level to the detailed level. What would be some main differences in how either the nonprofit operates or considerations they need to make when working or targeted most of their efforts toward non-humans, let's say animal shelter versus humans?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a big issue, especially in Canada, in our definition of what is considered charitable. So up until very recently, up until 2018, the law would be very much against any organization that was lobbying for political change. So anything that was very considered political activities, so lobbying, advocacy, you weren't allowed spending more than 10% of your budget on those kinds of activities. So let's say a shelter was trying to push for sterilization policies or anti-cruelty policies, especially in Quebec, which had the worst, the lowest cruelty laws back in the day. Well, they would not be able to be considered a charity. So they had a lot of hard times getting that charitable status. Also, in the definition of what is considered charitable in those 4 categories that we have in Canada, protecting animals in and of itself is not considered charitable. So those 2 issues made it so that organizations like the SPCA or smaller shelters or any animal rights organizations, they had a harder time getting their charitable status. And so because of that, had some disadvantages. So once they gained charitable status in Canada, they would be able to apply for foundation grants, for example. If they don't have that status, they cannot receive grants from foundations. The second one is that they can't give out tax receipts if they don't get that charitable status, which can be a huge, in reality, a lot of people don't consider that as the number one motivation to give. However, if you're thinking of major gifts, if someone's going to give you a $20,000 donation, you better believe that they're going to probably want that tax receipt. So that's one of the issues that really affected, I think, a lot of animal organizations is getting that charitable status. Of course, for shelters, it's a bit different because they can prove that it causes benefits to humans. So they're allowed to getting the charitable status. So that's kind of like a way around it. But from the foundational perspective, there's still very few organizations that give out grants for animals. So the landscape of what is available to them is different compared to, let's say, an organization helping children or helping, a university or students. There's tons of foundations that give out grants for those causes. But for animals and even the environment up until very recently was under 3% of total philanthropic giving. So it's a much more competitive landscape, I would say, on from a philanthropic grant perspective. Second of all, from an individual perspective, you have people that care and gift for animal causes are a very specific population, and they will often just give to animals. Like you have those crazy cat ladies, not to get too much into the stereotype, but it's kind of true. People that are animal lovers and that are passionate about animals will probably dedicate most of their philanthropic giving to animals. But there's still a small percentage of the population that will do so. Everyone else seems to see it as an us versus them of, how can you give to animals when there are children suffering? And I actually, having been a street fundraiser, I was a canvasser for an animal rights organization, being on the streets, collecting funds. I got spit on. I've gotten yelled at and told, how dare you? How dare you be here protecting animal rights when there's children in Syria dying, or when there's, kids with cancer or people with other issues. And so it was very much like, if you defend animals, it's as if you're not helping humans. And so I think that's both from a legal context with the charitable status, and then more this perspective of, if you give to animals, you're almost harming humans, like you're taking away, are 2 of the main issues I think that impede a lot of the fundraising strategies for a lot of nonprofits in the space.
It seems really counterintuitive to have to prove to certain governments that we're a charitable organization because through animals we're helping humans. It seems. Do you know if it's still the case today, and is it or have things developed in other parts of the world as well? Because I know that we're talking a lot about Quebec, the province of Quebec in Canada, but I want to make sure it's also a global perspective, or at least a North American perspective. Do you know if there are similar oddities, I'll call them, in other parts of North America today?
I know that in the States, it's not the same context. Like they don't have the same differentiations between nonprofits and charities. So it's not the same legal context. From a sociological perspective, do they have those same ideas of giving towards animals and humans? Probably. But from a legal, structural, institutional perspective, I think that Canada is a bit different in that, and that our definition of charity has not evolved since like 150 years. Like it's been so long since that definition has evolved, and still that the three main categories of what charitable giving is still religion, education, and the relief of poverty, which is very much like the old school Catholic religious background of what charity is. It's not what I would consider now as philanthropy. It's charity, which is not necessarily solving any root problems. It's really more just band-aid solutions, that old style charitable perspective. And then you have this fourth category, which is, and all other charitable activities, which is very vague. And so I think that there's a lot of space in that fourth category, which has evolved, and there's been definitions, and you can look up now on the CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency. They have different examples of what is considered charitable, and there are some for animals, but they're still very limiting. It's like you said, it's not defending animals in and of itself that is considered right. And there's still a lot of fear around being too political and advocating for legal changes. So becoming more of an advocacy group. A lot of environmental charities lost their charitable status during the Harper years because they were being too advocacy oriented, and they lost their status. So there's still a lot of reticence. I have a blank for the English word. There's still a lot of pushback on becoming too political for fear of losing your charitable status, which, if you think about it, the laws are not meant to defend animals in our current society. They're human laws. They're meant to prioritize and take care of human advantages, which is, I believe, normal, and it's not necessarily surprising. However, as an animal or even an environmental charity, you have to be creating the laws to allow you to defend them. Because actually defending laws is considered charitable. So if there was, let's say, an anti-cruelty law, and an organization existed to promote it and educate and to make sure that it was enforced, that would be considered charitable. But if the laws don't exist, then how are you supposed to enforce them? And so that's where there's a lot of issues of kind of like the chicken or the egg of like, well, we need to start somewhere. And so now since 2018, since the law has changed, and now you can do more political activities as long as they fit within your cause and they're nonpartisan, I think that's going to change. And I think that there's hopefully going to be more evolution around what we can fund in the animal space.
That us versus them perspective makes me snicker, because you could say that about everything. Like, I get it that they can start an argument with that, saying if you're not helping humans, or you shouldn't be helping animals because humans need help. But even within humans, you could say that at multiple levels. Like, if we're helping Africans, how come we're not helping the people here locally? If we're not helping the people who are this, you can, I mean, there's layers that you can go on. There's an onion that never ends. So it's a really poor argument in my mind. And I know I've read statistics, and I know it's more human focused, but when the lowest level of person is supported, is helped, who can achieve many things, like it comes down to the weakest link. When your weakest link is strong, then society in general benefits. If we can get everybody in India, for example, with education, with access to internet, fresh water, all that stuff, then the world becomes a better place. If there are areas of the world where women are suppressed and they have the benefits that should be awarded to them, then as a species, as a human species, and even plants and animals, we all benefit as a result of that. So,
I think that all comes down to the fact that we live in a very disconnected world where we see things as all separate individual things. And yet we're part of a system. Humans are only part of an ecosystem as much as a plant is or an animal is. And yet we see this thing of where here's humans, and oh, look, over there is nature. And it's like, no. Even if this is a concrete jungle, we're still part of nature to a certain degree, and we have to stop separating ourselves so much from that. And I think that's where a lot of people don't realize. And just like you say, if animals are probably one of the weaker the lower, small, weakest links, if you could say, in our society, in the sense that they don't have a voice. I think plants are even lower to that because we don't even consider them alive. And so we could just kill them without any qualms. But I do agree that there has been a lot of connections made from a philosophical perspective around how we treat animals and how we treat even other human beings, and how there are animals that are being more like better treated than other humans in other parts of the world. And so it really makes me laugh how people make that connection. I mean, don't make that connection of, well, if the planet is messed up and if the planet goes to hell, I hope you know that humans are going to hell too. And our entire society was actually built up thanks to animal exploitation and animal support. If you look back, that first domestication of the dog, of the wolf that became a dog, they've been our companion for how many thousands of years? We've been living, co-living with animals for so long that they're part of our society. They're part of our DNA, as much as we don't want to think about it, maybe in that sense, because we want to stay in this like, no, they're not the same. They don't feel the same things as us. Anyone who's ever had a dog will probably say the opposite, because animals are much more sentient than we give them credit for, and much more intelligent than we give them credit for. And people know, I think they just don't want to face that reality, because then they'd have to change their behaviors. And that's something that a lot of people have a hard time with.
Yeah, I totally agree on that one. And it's interesting how it was a comedian that said this, depending on the cuteness level of the animal, the more we care. The more cute the animal is, the otter, the cat, the dog, we care of them. But the more ugly or odd, let's say, the animal is, we care less. It's a really weird spectrum.
Well, you can see that even in, let's say, biodiversity loss, or when you're talking about like species that are about to go extinct. Like, people care about the megafauna, the polar bear, the koala, the panda, like the cute little baby tiger. That's what we want to protect. If I tell you that, oh, there's this creepy frog that is, about to go extinct in the forest, and it's going to have a huge impact on the ecosystem. Like, okay, maybe frogs are kind of cute, but like, let's say a salamander or like a bug, any insect, people don't care because they can't relate to it. Our feelings of connection come with animals that we can relate to. And I think that is natural, as much as parents, like, our babies are cute so that we are forced to take care of them. I think there's also this biological instinct that comes into play here. Thank God babies are cute. And that's why when you domesticate animals, they become more like puppies. So if you look at dogs, they're actually just puppy wolves that just never grow up, so that we keep on having that desire to take care of them. I actually have a pug, and I look at him, I'm like, you never would have survived out in the wild. Like, you'd be dead. Like, you wouldn't exist. You cannot exist as a dog. Like, can't breathe. Like, you bring him outside and he's just like dying in 2 seconds. I'm like, oh my God, thank God you're cute, kind of. But yeah, I think that there is something to say around that, wanting to protect what we are attracted to, because we can connect to it more, and it evokes this feeling, which also is counterintuitive for a lot of environmental protection organizations that are like, yeah, I get it that like pandas are cute, but we actually need to protect this random little rodent in the middle of the forest, because that is a keystone species for the ecosystem. So there is also like, it can help in defending certain causes, and it actually can be really toxic in the other sense of they're not actually doing what's necessary or what's most needed.
You keep on giving me awesome threads to pull on in this conversation, and I don't know if we'll keep this part, but I'll just mention it anyway, and we'll decide later. Have you ever heard, do you know the comedian George Carlin?
It rings a bell.
So he's a comedian. He died several years ago, and a little dark humor, but just brilliant on stage, stand up. And one of his pitches was about saying, and I'm never going to do it justice because you really need to watch it for yourself. But the idea is that he says, I'm really tired of people saying, save the planet, save the planet. Like, the planet is going to go anywhere anytime soon. All these catastrophes, all these things we're doing to the planet's going to shake us off like a bad cold. Like, the planet's not going to go anywhere. We're the ones that are going to, and it's that whole framing of how he said it. And of course, the tone and the pausing and the comedic element to it. Absolutely brilliant. So if you do, but we do keep this portion into the into the recording. I recommend, dear listener, of checking out George Carlin and the Save the Planet skit. But let's get back to our topic of fundraising and donating and
Fundraising.
philanthropy. I'm curious to know, because we did talk about also pre-show, how donors, volunteers how they interact differently with a nonprofit that focuses at least on animal shelters, and the relationships between them, and how you convert donors to volunteers and vice versa. If you could paint us a picture of what that kind of looks like normally or typically with a animal shelter.
In an animal shelter, the difference is also, for example, in an opposite situation where, let's say, a hospital where parents have their kids that are sick, they'll want to become donors of the hospital that saved them. But with animals, it's not the same in a shelter, because a lot of people, they're not going there to help their own animals. They're going there to leave their animals. And so there's less of this sentiment of like, you're helping me, because of the way it's framed. And I think that is falsely framed. And I'll give an example of how there's a lack of philanthropic culture in a lot of nonprofits. And this is not just specific to animal shelters, where the fundraising department takes care of fundraising. The volunteers take care of volunteers. The volunteer department takes care of volunteers with human resources. And then the staff on the floor, they'll take care of the operations. And there's not a connection between the three. When I was working at the Montreal SPCA I worked there for about 5 years during my university degree, I did all the departments. I went from working the foster care department to cleaning those delicious kennels in the morning to working reception and getting the animals that were coming in. I did all of it. And I started noticing a pattern. First of all, everyone hated humans, which was, great. But then, being the social butterfly that I am and being very social, I started just taking the time to listen more and just be more curious. And I was at reception one day, and this woman came in to bring in these 2 kittens, and they were feral kittens, but they were like young enough to be saved and to be able to be socialized. And she was like, I'm trying to catch the mom so that we can stop having babies. Like, I know she's never going to be adoptable, but at least if she can live her life and not have more babies, would be great. Like, this woman knew what she was talking about. She understood the issue. And so for stray animals, usually when people bring them in, the fees are covered by the city. So the person bringing it in doesn't have to pay anything. But I decided, you know what? This woman seems to care. So I just asked, well, would you like to make a donation today to support us taking care of these kittens? And she was like, yeah, sure. And she gave us a $250 donation. And that's not nothing. And for a one-time donation, for our first time, that is a big gift that I didn't have to work for. And unfortunately, nobody else, I think, ever asked those kinds of questions to people bringing them in. They just assumed that's not my job. And these people are bringing in animals. They kind of automatically think that they're like, not necessarily bad people, but that they're not potential donors. So I think that there's this lack of education around that. And I don't see that as being specific to animal shelters, but I saw that very much of the people working there cared about animals. And so they didn't really relate very well with the people that they were interacting with. And for the volunteers, once again, it's a lot of emotionally draining. It's a very emotionally draining context to work in an animal shelter, where you're coming in, walking the dogs, let's say, every day or every week, and you get attached to them. And there was some volunteers that had this very unhealthy vision of it. They were like too extreme, and they weren't understanding the risks that they were taking, for example, with certain aggressive dogs or with cats that were sick, and that if we kept them, then we would, infect the whole shelter. And so sometimes there was also the safety issue of working with volunteers and animals, that they become very emotionally involved, and it created a big difficulty of doing that. So there's definitely specific issues. I mean, I'm sure it's the same with a lot of human causes as well. That's something I noticed per se, of knowing the difference. But the end is that you might be actually having to euthanize an animal.
Because I love talking about technology and nonprofits, I'm curious to know if there's any tech differences between nonprofits that deal with non-humans and versus humans, in terms of, your CRM or your marketing tools, or any other tech that you can think of that would be different.
Definitely. So, and I know we've shared this story of when I was at the Montreal SPCA, and I think when you had adopted your dog there as well, we were still working with a paper system. Brilliant idea. So it was a very, let's just say, messy situation where every animal had its own paper file, and obviously they would get lost, and it was just hell in a haystack. It was really ridiculous. And one of the big challenges when we started doing the transition towards an electronic, like an online CRM, is that not only are you managing all your volunteers, your humans, your volunteers, your employees, all of these people need to have their own accesses. They need to do it. But then you also have to incorporate the animal component. So you have to have animal profiles that have different components, different information. So it's definitely a more complex system. And you have kind of the managing of the shelter, and then you have the management of, let's say, your fundraising. And they might not be compatible or not have the same data. And so a lot of times, from my understanding, is that people will use different CRMs. They'll use one to like manage their shelter, and then they'll use one to do their fundraising, because it'll have different types of users, different types of profiles. And so it creates this separation. And one of the biggest downsides, I believe, to doing that is that you're not taking advantage of the fact that people that are adopting animals are going to most likely be your top prospects to volunteer, to donate, to become maybe even a long-term like major giver or major gift, or even, who knows, they might give you money in their will, but you have to keep in contact with them. And so by separating those two CRMs, of one that is focused more on managing the shelter components of the adopter profiles, et cetera, and then the other one that is a donor database, you're really missing out on a lot of opportunities to build those connections. So I would say that is one of the main technological challenges. A lot of animal shelters and animal organizations, that anything that would probably manage that human animal relationship component, it adds a level of complexity for sure.
It's a very common challenge, even with human nonprofits, silos and not sharing information, when, especially in your case, because it's maybe more of a niche industry where people who care about animals care maybe more deeply than some other, maybe not more deeply, maybe that's a bad characterization, but at least some of them are very passionate. I'm thinking about that crazy cat lady you mentioned earlier.
Oh God.
The people who are, when you're in it, you're really in it. Like you're really part of the movement. So yeah, being able to shift people who adopt, people who leave animals there, people who volunteer. I did volunteering actually at a dog walking, where I was volunteering to do dog walking in San Francisco. And, had they asked me at the time to donate, I would have, because I'm already invested in the well-being of these animals. But of course, no one did, sadly.
And that's such a recurring issue of even some of the clients I work with. I'm like, well, do the members of your board donate? And they're like, well, they're already donating their time. I'm like, yeah, but they care so much. They're an amazing prospect of just asking. Even it doesn't have to be $1 million, but have you even asked them, or have you asked your volunteers to donate, or have you asked your donors to volunteer? Like, it's not because they're doing one that it means that they will not be open to the other. A lot of people have these strange ideas around generosity, as if like there's a limit to your own generosity, when in fact, I feel people that are generous are going to be more generous. So when I was working in street fundraising, like I mentioned before, people would say, oh, well, they were already donating to another cause. And I'm like, okay, so then they know how it works. And so they're comfortable with giving monthly. So they're much less likely to say no, because they see that it's not a big deal. And that a lot of my people that I was training would be like, oh, I never thought of it that way. And I was like, yeah, I know. That's why I'm here to train you. But it was this weird vision of that generosity has a limit, and that we can't surpass it, and that you can't ask too much of people. It's like, well, if they're not going to do it, they'll just say no. But if you don't ask, you'll never know. And I think that's a major issue in a lot of organizations, not just animal ones. But yeah, people that care about animals, I think, like you say, are a bit intense sometimes. And so they're probably great prospects to ask to be like, hey, well, do you also want to make a yearly donation of, even if it's just like $20, like, why not? Just ask them. It's the worst that's going to happen.
I love the phrase from Wayne Gretzky, our famous Canadian hockey player, that said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
So
for you sure. Need to ask to receive sometimes. There's no harm. And the worst they could say is no.
Yeah. And is it really that bad? Like, are you, I always talk to my stepson like, but did you die? Like, is it really the end of the world? And he's always like, stop it. But it's true. Like it's not. And I do the same. We're always scared of these things. But then when you think about it, like, okay, but what's the worst that's going to happen? And it's often nothing serious.
So aside from all these changes in how nonprofit fundraising and nonprofit organizations work in the last few years, any trends you see in toward the future, or anything you would like to see going toward the future?
Definitely. I would like to see more collaboration between different causes. So on my own podcast that I'm going to be launching soon, I talk a lot about the interconnection of different causes. So I'll give you a very concrete example of how beautiful that could look like and what it could be. There's this animal shelter out in Vancouver, Pause for Hope. They focus on keeping families together, including pets. So let's say a family's going through a hard time. Usually they would probably have access to social services to get food baskets or to get food stamps or to get clothes. But what about their pet? What if they have a pet and they want to keep their animal? They love their animal. It's part of their family, but they don't have the funds necessary to pay for the vet bills or to pay for the food or whatever. They need a new leash. Who knows? Well, an animal shelter can also be kind of a social service of helping these families in need of, okay, you need vet care. Well, wouldn't it make more sense for us to pay for that animal surgery than for that family to have to abandon their animal? They're still going to need to do the surgery. And then they're going to have to house and find a new home for that animal and hope that it's as good of a family. So that's, I think, a really great approach of connecting the social aspects of the human component to the animal component. And I think if we have more of those collaborations, we're going to be able to see an opening in funding opportunities as well. So this animal shelter is not just helping animals anymore. They're also helping the humans behind them. And so then that opens up the door of that opportunity they were talking about before around grant funding. There's not as many for animals. Well, this would open up funding opportunities for projects that kind of see that connection between the two. There's so many examples that I have of this one in Hawaii that my friend was telling me about that he worked on, where the animal shelter's foster program partnered up with a child foster program where the children tend to feel alone, they feel abandoned, and they don't have this connection with their foster parents. And so then what if they also were fostering an animal at the same time? And that creates a connection between the foster child living this, like taking care of a foster animal until living the same situation as the foster parents. And then it allows them to kind of see the world from a different perspective and also build a connection with another being that is going through the same thing as them so that they're not alone. When I hear about stories like that, like I just got the chills. Like it makes my heart, like as cheesy as it sounds, just that is what we're here to do. It's to make those connections. It's not about, okay, screw the humans, we're going to take care about animals or vice versa. It's about finding the connections between those causes of how we can help each other out. The elderly who are isolated, who want that emotional support. Let's bring in some foster kittens or some foster cats that they can just pet for a couple hours or take care of them and have someone watch over them. There's so many opportunities to build bridges between different causes that I think that's what should and will be happening in the years to come.
That's a lovely story with the foster child and foster pet.
I know.
Never heard of that before, and that's really
it's beautiful.
Touching.
Yeah. I hope it gets more widespread.
Yeah. And going back to the elderly as well, I heard stories how some elderly who have arthritis, for example, they forget they have arthritis for a moment to lean over to pet the dog. Mm-hmm. And that's just a wonderful story too. So just to have that connection between animal and human for a moment.
Well, there's even another, just to quickly wrap up, another example of that, of how there's this organization called Mutual Rescue they're in the States. And what they do is they just share stories about how when people are adopting from a shelter, there's not just one life that's being saved. There's often two. I have my own personal story of my father who he's struggled with depression, with different issues. And when he adopted his dog, when he got his dog, it changed him completely because now he had a being that he had to take out for walks, that he had to take care of, and that loved him no matter what, no matter how depressed he was, no matter how he felt like horrible, the dog loved him no matter what. And that I do believe to this day that his dog Finn really helped him go through that and survive. And there's countless stories of where it's not the human that saved the dog, it's the dog that saved the human, or the cat, or the whatever other animal, a rabbit. It could be any animal, that as long as there's that connection, that humans, we bond a lot with animals, and we don't tend to talk about it as much publicly, I think. I mean, we talk about it, we do, but that the animals can also be saving humans. And we don't tend to focus as much on that in the shelters of we're not just here to save animals. We're actually making other families be happy, which could have positive impacts on them as well. So the mutuality of rescue is something that is also, I think, needs to be talked about more.
I totally agree. Kat, this has been great. Where can people find more about you online?
I'm very much on LinkedIn. It is where I spend most of my time. So Katherine Lacefield on LinkedIn. And I will be launching my podcast soon as well. It's going to be called the Just Because podcast. You can definitely tune in to hear more about this interconnection between different causes as it shows up with animals, environment, and people. So that's the two places that I would recommend.
Awesome. Thank you, Kat, for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me. It was great.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.